The knock came at 3 in the morning, fists hammering against pine planks with the desperation of a drowning man clawing for surface. Caleb Winters crossed the cabin floor in 4 strides, wool socks silent on boards that radiated warmth like sun-baked stone in July, though outside the thermometer had long since surrendered any pretense of measuring cold that could shatter steel. Jacob Wright collapsed through the doorway the moment the latch lifted, ice crystals shattering from his beard, eyes hollowed by 5 nights of feeding flames that devoured cord after cord while delivering nothing but the illusion of warmth. Behind him, the Montana darkness pressed close, a living thing that swallowed sound and heat and hope with equal hunger. The older man's legs folded. Caleb caught him under the arms, felt the tremors running through muscle, too exhausted to shiver properly anymore. Jacob's mouth worked, but no words emerged, just the ragged wheeze of lungs that had been breathing smoke and desperation in equal measure. Sarah appeared from the back room, their newborn son bundled against her chest, his tiny fist visible above the blanket edge, skin pink and healthy in air that should have killed him days ago. She moved to the stove that wasn't there, to the fireplace that had never existed, to the source of heat that defied every principle Jacob Wright had spent 45 years believing was immutable truth. The mining engineer's gaze tracked across walls that seemed to glow from within, across the absence of flames, across the impossible fact of comfort in the teeth of cold that had just claimed Peter Sullivan's life 200 yards from his own front door. His hand rose, trembling, pressed against clay plaster smooth as riverstone. Warmth met his frozen palm, not the searing blast of cast iron gone red with overfeeding, not the fierce radiation of hearthstones superheated beyond wisdom, just steady, even heat emanating from the wall itself, as though the cabin had swallowed summer whole and was breathing it back into the January night, one gentle exhalation at a time. "How are you warm without a stove?" The question came out broken, half prayer, half accusation. Caleb guided him to the bench along the north wall, the one that ran hottest because the clay channels beneath carried smoke still fresh from the fire pit 20 feet distant. Jacob sank onto wood that felt alive with captured heat. "The crow taught me. You ready to listen now?" 4 months earlier, the question would have drawn laughter. 4 months earlier, Jacob Wright had been certain of many things. The land office in Bozeman smelled of pipe tobacco and ink gone thick in its September sun streaming through windows that overlooked a street ankle-deep in mud from recent rains. Caleb Winters signed his name in the ledger with careful strokes, the penmanship of a man who'd learned letters late but practiced them with devotion. 20 acres in the valley south of town, purchased with money earned from 3 seasons of hunting and trapping, from pelts sold and meat smoked, and the accumulated wages of a man who needed little and saved everything. The clerk barely glanced at him. Land office business had picked up since the railroad pushed through homesteaders flooding in from Minnesota and Wisconsin and Illinois, chasing the promise of free land and new starts. Most would be gone within 2 winters, broken by cold they'd never imagined, and isolation that ground souls to dust. Caleb knew the valley he'd purchased better than he knew the streets of Bozeman, had known it since he was 17, and the world had cracked open, spilling him into a life he'd never anticipated, but which had taught him everything that mattered about survival and country that forgave no mistakes. The memory rose unbidden as he guided his horse south through grass gone golden with autumn's first touch. His father's cabin consumed by flames on a January night in 1870, the cast iron stove overloaded with pine that burned too hot and too fast creosote in the chimney, igniting like gunpowder, the whole structure going up in minutes. His father had made it to the door before smoke took him. Caleb had been in the barn 17 years old, watching the only home he'd known become a pyre that lit the snow for half a mile in every direction. The crow had found him 3 days later, half frozen and stumbling south with no plan beyond putting distance between himself and the ashes. They could have left him. White settlers weren't universally welcome, especially young men who might grow into the kind who pushed westward with rifles and treaties that meant nothing. But Running Elk had seen something in the grief-shattered boy, some quality worth preserving, and had brought him to the winter camp along the Yellowstone River. 10 years, a decade spent learning a language that had no word for ownership the way white men understood it, that parsed the world through relationships and responsibilities rather than possession and profit. He'd learned to read weather in the behavior of ravens, to track elk through timber, so dense sunlight became a rumor to survive wind terrors, that killed the unprepared with casual indifference. He'd also learned to build. The earth lodges the Crow used for winter camps weren't the mobile tippies most white settlers associated with Plains tribes. They were permanent structures half sunk into the earth walls of logs and packed clay roofs thick with sod that grew grass come spring. And beneath the floors, Running Elk had shown him, ran channels of clay pipe that carried smoke from fire pits located outside the dwelling, smoke that traveled the length of the structure before emerging from vents positioned to catch prevailing winds. Heat without flames. Warmth without the constant feeding, the eternal vigilance, the risk that had killed his father and 100 other settlers who thought they understood fire because they could light one. The Crow had been using variations of the system for generations, knowledge passed down from earlier contact with Pueblo peoples to the south, adapted and refined for Montana's particular brutality. It worked. It had always worked. But when Caleb had tried to explain it to white settlers after returning to their world in 1885, after marrying Sarah and attempting to build a life that bridged two worlds, he'd been met with polite dismissal at best, open mockery at worst. Indian methods, savage technology, the phrases carried contempt so casual it didn't recognize itself as such. So he'd kept quiet, built a conventional cabin, suffered through winters, feeding a stove that ate wood faster than he could cut it, until his first child had died of pneumonia in a room that never got properly warm, where ice formed on the inside of windows and Sarah's breath came out in clouds even at midday. Until he'd stood over a tiny grave in March and decided that pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. The land he'd purchased sat in a natural bowl, sheltered from the worst winds, with a reliable spring and timber access for building. Good grass for the handful of sheep he planned to raise. Close enough to town for Sarah to maintain contact with the few other women in the territory, far enough that neighbors wouldn't be constantly underfoot asking questions he didn't want to answer. He marked the cabin site with stakes, then paced 20 feet west and marked the fire pit location. The distance mattered. Too close and the smoke would arrive too hot, making the clay pipes dangerous. Too far, and heat would dissipate before it reached the dwelling. Running Elk had taught him to measure it in strides, to factor in prevailing wind, to account for the way cold air sank and drew smoke downward if the exit vent wasn't positioned correctly. Jacob Wright rode up while Caleb was sketching the layout in the dirt with a stick, the mining engineer sitting his horse with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent decades in the saddle. He was old. Montana had been in the territory since the gold rush. Days of the 60s had seen fortunes made and lost, had built an empire of sorts, managing mining operations for Eastern investors who wanted profits without the inconvenience of actually living in the country that produced them. Planning your cabin statement. Not question. Jacob dismounted, ground-tied his horse, walked the perimeter Caleb had marked. His engineer's eye took in the dimensions, the orientation, the way Caleb had positioned the structure to catch winter sun on the south wall. Going to be a cold one come January. Word is the almanac's predicting heavy snow. Caleb nodded, kept sketching. The fire pit drew Jacob's attention, the way a magnet draws iron. The older man stood over the marked circle, boot toe, tracing the outline. Fire pit for cooking, for heating. The silence stretched long enough that a crow landed in a nearby cottonwood, he'd twice departed. Jacob's expression cycled through confusion to comprehension, to something that might have been concern. Heating. You're planning to heat the cabin from a fire pit 20 feet away. That's right. Another silence, this one with weight behind it. Jacob crouched, studying the marks Caleb had scratched, showing the underground channel that would carry smoke from pit to cabin. The engineer's fingers traced the path, mind clearly working through the mechanics, the physics, the fundamental problem of moving heat across distance without losing it to the Montana cold. I've heard of systems like this. Russian Pechkas, German Grundolphins. Saw a setup in Colorado back in '89 fellow who'd emigrated from Austria tried to build one. Failed spectacularly. Clay pipes cracked from the temperature differential, smoke backed up into the living space, nearly killed his family before he abandoned the whole mess and installed a conventional stove. The Crow have been using this method for generations. Jacob straightened, and there it was, the shift Caleb had seen 100 times before. The polite skepticism that wasn't quite polite enough to hide what lay beneath. The automatic dismissal that came whenever anyone suggested that the people white settlers had pushed onto reservations might possess knowledge worth learning. The Crow. Indian methods. Their winters are colder than ours. They've survived them for 500 years with this system. Montana's different from wherever they came up with this. Different altitude, different wind patterns, different everything. And with all respect, Winters, the conditions that work for a temporary hunting camp aren't the same as what you need for a permanent family dwelling. This isn't temporary camp knowledge. Running Elk's grandmother lived to 90 in an earth lodge heated this way. My father died at 45 in a cabin with a stove. The words came out harder than Caleb had intended. Jacob's expression shifted, something like sympathy crossing his weathered features. I heard about the fire. Terrible thing. But the solution to a stove malfunction isn't abandoning the technology entirely. It's building better, maintaining properly, being careful. Being careful didn't save him. Being careful doesn't save the 3 or 4 families every winter who freeze or burn or suffocate from smoke. This way is safer. Safer based on what European engineers have been working on masonry heater designs for centuries. They're complicated, expensive, and even when built correctly, they're prone to failure in climates like ours. You're telling me Indian tribes figured out something better using primitive materials and no understanding of thermodynamics. The contempt wasn't even conscious. Caleb knew. That was what made it so insidious. Jacob genuinely believed that education, that European training, that the accumulated knowledge of white civilization was inherently superior to anything developed by people who couldn't read, who didn't build universities, who organized their societies around principles. Jacob's world had decided we're backward. They understand heat. They understand clay. They understand how to survive in cold that would kill most white men in a night. That's not primitive, that's refined over generations into something that works. Works how? What happens when those clay pipes you're planning fill with soot and creosote? What happens when temperature changes, crack the joints? What happens when your wife wakes up breathing smoke because the whole system failed in the middle of January? The clay is mixed with sand for flexibility. The pipes are sized large enough that soot doesn't block airflow. The system is cleaned once yearly with long brushes, same as any chimney. And it doesn't fail because there's no intense heat differential to cause cracking. The fire burns moderate and slow smoke travels through the channels. Releasing heat gradually exits at low enough temperature that it doesn't stress the materials. Jacob pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket, the kind engineers carried to sketch ideas and work through calculations. He flipped to a blank page, began drawing. Show me the channel layout, the pipe dimensions, how you plan to create, draw without a chimney. For the next hour, they sat in the dirt while Caleb translated Running Elk's teachings into diagrams Jacob's trained mind could parse. The serpentine pattern the pipes would follow through the walls, rising and falling to maximize contact with thermal mass. The exit vent positioned at the highest point, angled to catch wind and create natural draw. The fire pit design that would burn wood slowly and completely, producing smoke at optimal temperature for heat transfer. Jacob asked questions that demonstrated both intelligence and skepticism, probing for weaknesses, testing assumptions. He found several. The Montana wind patterns were different from what Caleb had experienced in the Crow camps further east. The altitude might affect draw. The available clay from the Yellowstone River might not have the same properties as what Running Elk's people used. But as the discussion progressed, something shifted in Jacob's demeanor. The automatic dismissal gave way to cautious interest. The engineer in him recognized that the principles at least were sound. Heat captured rather than vented. Thermal mass storing and releasing energy. Insulation preventing loss. The execution might fail, but the theory had merit. Finally, Jacob closed his notebook, stood, brushed dirt from his trousers. I'll make you a deal, Winters. You build this system of yours, and when January comes, if it keeps your family warm through a hard freeze, without burning half a cord of wood a day, I'll build 20 units for my miners. I've got men living in bunkhouses that are barely habitable, spending more time feeding stoves than sleeping. If Indian methods can solve that problem, then I'm enough of a pragmatist to use them. But if it fails, if you end up installing a conventional stove, come December, because your family's freezing, you admit publicly that Indian ways are inferior to European engineering when it comes to practical application in Montana conditions. The challenge hung between them. Caleb recognized it for what it was, not really about heating systems at all, but about larger questions of whose knowledge mattered, whose wisdom deserved respect. He could refuse, could tell Jacob that he didn't need to prove anything. But 20 miners spending winters in warmth instead of misery, 20 families who might avoid the fate his father had met that was worth swallowing pride. Deal. They shook on it. Jacob's grip firmed the handshake of a man who honored agreements even when they cost him. He mounted his horse, adjusted his hat against the lowering sun. One more thing, Winters. That wife of yours, the Boston girl, Sarah, right? She know what you're planning, she knows, and she approves. Caleb's silence answered the question more eloquently than words could have managed. Jacob's expression suggested he'd expected as much. Women are practical creatures. They want homes that work, families that survive. You might want to make sure she's on board before you stake everything on proving Indian methods superior. Winter's a hell of a time to be right, but frozen. Sarah was not on board. The argument started the moment Caleb showed her where the stove would not be where the hearth she'd been planning around the focal point of the home she'd imagined would never exist. She'd followed him through the cabin site on a cool October morning, her hand resting unconsciously on her belly 3 months along, though they'd told no one yet. The first pregnancy had ended at 6 months, the baby arriving too early, too small, lungs unable to draw breath in an air that never got warm enough, that carried always the damp chill of a cabin, built like every other cabin in the territory, with walls too thin and gaps too wide, and a stove that ate fuel without delivering the steady warmth an infant needed to thrive. Caleb had watched his daughter die over 3 days, her tiny chest working harder and harder each breath, a labor she eventually lacked the strength to complete. The doctor from Bozeman had come too late, had stood over the small body, and pronounced what everyone already knew had collected his fee and ridden away, and Caleb had understood with perfect clarity that European methods in white medicine had failed the test that mattered most. So when Sarah stood in the center of the marked cabin floor and asked where the stove would go, where the cooking would happen, where the heat would come from during January nights, when cold seeped through every crack and gap, Caleb pointed to the fire pit location 20 feet distant and explained about clay pipes and thermal mass and smoke that worked before it left. No fire inside. Her voice carried no inflection, just flatness that suggested she was working very hard to maintain control. Her breath misted in the morning air, visible proof of the cold she was imagining, multiplied by factors of 10 cold that would arrive when this new child was 2 months old, when tiny lungs would need warmth. Not cleverness, heat, not theory. In Mongolia, this works. The Crow have used it for generations. But here, Caleb here, where we're already outcasts because you lived with Indians for 10 years, where half the town thinks I'm married beneath myself, where our child will grow up hearing whispers about savage blood and primitive ways. Here you want to build a cabin that everyone will point to as proof that you can't let go of Indian methods long enough to live like a civilized person. The words landed like blows, not because they were unfair, but because they were accurate. Sarah had sacrificed much to marry him. Her family in Boston had disowned her. The small teaching position she'd held had evaporated when it became known she was courting a man who'd lived among the Crow. The few women in Bozeman who might have become friends kept polite distance, unwilling to fully embrace someone who'd chosen to tie herself to a man with one foot still in the world white society was trying to erase. They already think we're different. At least this way we'll be warm while they judge us. And if the pipes crack, if the smoke leaks into the cabin while we sleep, if this child dies because you were too stubborn to build a normal home with a normal stove, the pipes won't crack. I'll build them the way running elk taught me. Clay mixed with sand in the right proportions, dried slowly to prevent stress fractures, sealed with lime mortar that flexes rather than breaking. You're staking our child's life on techniques you learn from people who live in tents. They don't live in tents in winter. They live in earth lodges with heated floors and walls warm enough to sleep against. Running Elk's grandmother was 90 when she died, and she spent every winter of her life in structures heated this way. Sarah turned away, arms crossed over her chest. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the rigid line of her spine. She'd come west believing in new starts and the possibility of building something meaningful in country raw enough to accept people who didn't fit elsewhere. 3 years into that dream, and she'd buried one child, was carrying another with fear instead of joy, was watching her husband propose a method of living that would mark them more permanently than any choice either of them had made. The Americans have stoves, iron stoves that work, that don't require reinventing how people live. Why must we be different? Because their stoves burn 10 times the wood and still leave families cold. Because I watched men wake every 2 hours all winter to feed flames that give less than they take. Because our way is better has been proven better for generations, and the only reason no one uses it here is pride and prejudice. Your way, the Indian way, not our way, Caleb. Your way that you learned from people most of Montana wants to forget exist. The accusation stung because it carried truth. He was asking her to trust not just his judgment, but the wisdom of a people her world had decided were obstacles to progress. To bet their child's survival on knowledge that came without diplomas or engineering degrees or any of the credentials white civilization recognized as legitimate. If it doesn't work by November 1st, I'll install a regular stove. You can pick it out, have it shipped from wherever you want. But give this a chance. Give Running Elk's knowledge a chance to prove itself. Sarah was quiet for a long time, gaze distant, processing calculations he couldn't quite follow. Finally, she nodded once sharp, November 1st. If that cabin isn't warm by then, if I can't imagine bringing a baby into it, you put in a proper stove and we never speak of Indian methods again. Agreed. She walked back toward town without another word, leaving him alone with stakes in the ground and a promise that felt like a noose. What Caleb didn't know, what he wouldn't discover until December, was that Sarah had already begun writing letters. One to her sister in Denver, asking for a loan to purchase a cast iron stove. Another to a supplier in Chicago, inquiring about models suitable for Montana winter's prices and shipping times. She sealed them but didn't send them, kept them in a wooden box beneath their bed insurance, against the moment when Caleb's Indian wisdom proved insufficient and she'd need to act fast to save the child she was carrying. The construction began with the fire pit excavated 3 feet deep into soil that fought him every inch. This wasn't the soft earth of river bottoms, but hard pan mixed with rock soil that had been compressed by glaciers and baked by 1,000 summers. He used a pickaxe when the shovel wouldn't penetrate, swinging until his shoulders screamed, until blisters rose and popped and rose again as calluses. He lined the pit with flat stones hauled from the Bridger Mountains igneous rock that had been forged in heat greater than any fire he'd build and would withstand centuries without cracking. The stones fit together like a puzzle, each one placed with mortar, mixed from river clay and sand joints, sealed tight against smoke, that would want to escape anywhere it could find purchase. The underground channel left the fire pit through a stone tunnel 18 inches across, dug below the frost line to prevent freezing from collapsing the passage. Caleb lined it with the same flat stones, created a smooth pathway that wouldn't trap ash or create turbulence that might affect draw. The channel ran true for 20 feet compass, straight toward the cabin foundation. He was simultaneously digging two projects moving forward in parallel. Neighbors rode by ostensibly to check boundaries or ask about strayed livestock, but really to see what Caleb was building in the valley. They saw the pit and assumed a root cellar. They saw the channel and guessed at drainage. Nobody asked directly because that would have required admitting curiosity about an outcast project, but the speculation rippled through Bozeman like wind through wheat. The German fellow Friedrich Bowman stopped one afternoon with a wagon load of wool from his sheep. He'd heard Caleb was buying, willing to pay better than the mills in town because he wanted it raw and unwashed, full of the lanolin that would make it water resistant. You're building something unusual. Statement of fact from a man who'd crossed an ocean and survived Montana winters that killed the unprepared. Friedrich had lasted 7 years, which meant he possessed both intelligence and adaptability qualities Caleb respected. Using methods I learned from the Crow. Heating system that doesn't require a stove inside the cabin. Friedrich studied the fire pit, walked the length of the channel. His expression remained neutral, but his questions demonstrated understanding. He asked about draw, about smoke temperature, about how Caleb planned to regulate heat output, the questions of an engineer or at least of someone who thought systematically about problems. In the old country, some farmers use underfloor heating for barns. Keeps animals warm and improves milk production. Never worked well. Pipes always froze or clogged. You think this will be different? The Crow have been doing it successfully for generations. Different materials, different design, but the principle is proven. Proven for Indians. We'll see if it proves for white families. Not contempt, just pragmatism. Friedrich bought Caleb's explanation, or didn't. Either way, he'd wait for results before committing judgment. He sold Caleb 400 pounds of raw wool at fair price, helped load it into Caleb's wagon, departed with a nod that might have meant respect or might have meant nothing at all. The cabin walls rose through June and July, heavy timber posts at the corners and every 4 feet along the perimeter. Between the posts, Caleb built double walls, an outer shell of horizontal logs chinked with clay, an inner shell that would eventually be smooth plaster over woven willow frames. The space between the walls measured 3 feet of cavity that would house both the clay pipes and the wool insulation that would turn those walls into thermal batteries capable of storing heat for hours after the fire died. The clay pipes required patience Caleb hadn't known he possessed. He dug clay from the Yellowstone River, the particular deposits Running Elk had shown him years before, bentonite-rich mud that had specific properties. It absorbed water readily, but released it slowly, which meant it could be worked wet and would dry without cracking if given time. Mixed with sand in a 3:2 ratio with prairie grass chopped fine as a binder, it became a material that could withstand temperature cycling without failing. He formed the pipes by hand, rolling the mixture around wooden dowels 4 inches in diameter, building walls an inch thick. Each section measured 2 feet long, with flared ends that would nest together and be sealed with fresh clay mixed with lime. The lime added flexibility, allowed the joints to give slightly when heat caused expansion, prevented the stress fractures that had killed Jacob's Colorado experiment. Drying was critical. Rush it, and the clay would crack, develop microfractures that would worsen under heat stress, and eventually fail catastrophically. Caleb built drying racks under canvas shelters, laid the pipes on bed of sand, rotated them every day to ensure even moisture loss. 72 hours minimum for each batch, longer if humidity was high. The process was maddeningly slow. He could only make 8 pipes at a time, and he needed over 100 for the full serpentine network. Jacob Wright rode by in early August, ostensibly checking on an investment property nearby. He dismounted, examined the pipes Caleb had drying in the shade. Quality looks good. Clay to sand ratio appears correct. Wall thickness is consistent. These might actually work where the Austrian fellows didn't. Might, the word carried skepticism still, but softened the engineer in Jacob, forced to acknowledge competent work when he saw it. You help me install them for a couple days, I'll show you exactly how it's done. Then when you build your miners' bunkhouses, you'll have hands-on experience. You're that confident it'll work. I'm confident in Running Elk's knowledge. Whether Montana approves doesn't change the physics. Jacob spent 3 days helping position pipes in the wall cavity, connecting sections, sealing joints with clay mortar that Caleb mixed fresh each morning. The work was precise, demanding the kind of construction that required 2 sets of hands in constant attention. They built the network in sections, starting where the underground channel entered the cabin foundation, running pipes up 3 feet across, 4 feet, down 3 feet across, again a continuous path that would eventually snake through all 4 walls. As they worked, Jacob's questions shifted from skeptical to genuine curiosity. He wanted to understand not just what Caleb was building, but why specific choices were made, what principles governed the design. Why not run the pipes higher in the walls where warm air naturally gathers? Because the smoke enters low and needs somewhere to rise into. You run pipes too high and you lose the circulation pattern. Also, lower pipes heat the space where people actually sit and sleep. Heat at the ceiling is wasted. The exit vent, why position it at the far wall instead of directly above the entry point, maximum travel distance for heat transfer. Smoke enters here, agrees. There has to traverse the entire structure to do it. Every foot it travels, it's giving up energy to the clay. What prevents backdraft when the fire's not burning? The pipes stay warmer than outside air even after the fire dies. As long as there's any temperature, differential draw continues. Plus, the exit vent is angled to catch prevailing wind, creates slight negative pressure that pulls rather than pushes. Jacob absorbed it all, made notes in his small book, asked follow-up questions that demonstrated he was thinking through applications beyond this single cabin. On the 3rd day, as they sealed the final connection and prepared to begin wool installation, he stood back and studied the network they'd created. I was wrong to call this primitive. This is sophisticated work based on deep understanding of thermodynamics, even if Running Elk wouldn't have used that term. If it performs as designed, it is superior to anything I've seen. The qualification still existed, that if, but the contempt was gone, replaced by the provisional respect one engineer extends to another pending field testing. The wool insulation went in last 400 pounds of raw fleece packed carefully around the clay pipes. Caleb worked from inside the wall cavity wearing gloves to protect against the lanolin that would otherwise crack his skin, stuffing wool into every gap and space until the 3-foot walls were solid with springy, dense material that would trap air and prevent heat loss. The wool smelled like sheep in rain and the particular sweetness of grass the animals had eaten. It wanted to compress where Caleb needed it to stay. Lofted wanted to pull away from the pipes where it needed to make contact. He worked sections at a time, tamping and adjusting, ensuring consistent density, because any thin spots would become cold spots that would compromise the entire system. Sarah came to the building site twice a week, brought food and water, watched progress with an expression Caleb couldn't read. Sometimes she asked questions about the construction, seemed genuinely interested in understanding how the system would work. Other times she stood silent, hand on her belly, calculating equations that had nothing to do with heat transfer and everything to do with betting an infant's survival on her husband's certainty. By late September, the cabin was complete, structurally 16 feet by 20 interior, with walls 3 feet thick, clay pipes hidden within wool insulation, creating barriers no conventional cabin could match. The interior walls were smooth clay plaster that Sarah had helped apply, her hands more practiced at creating even surfaces than his. She'd painted the plaster white using lime wash, transformed rough utility into something that felt like a home. October 3rd dawned clear and cold, the first frost of autumn silvering the grass. Caleb lit the fire in the external pit, dry pine and juniper burning hot and clean smoke, rising from the pit and vanishing into the underground channel. He fed the fire steadily for 2 hours, adding wood in measured amounts, watching the smoke that emerged from the distant vent, gauging temperature by color and volume. Then he sealed the fire pit with its iron cover, banked the coals to burn slow, and waited. The first indication something was wrong came as acrid smell smoke seeping into the cabin through gaps Caleb couldn't immediately identify. Sarah appeared in the doorway, alarm crossing her features as haze began filling the interior space. "Caleb, what's happening?" He was already moving, checking joints, examining the plaster for cracks, mind racing through possible failure points. The smoke was coming from the exit vent, flowing backward into the cabin instead of outward into the Montana morning. He climbed onto the roof, found the vent pipe, discovered the problem immediately. A bird's nest. Dried grass and twigs packed into the vent opening, restricting airflow enough that smoke couldn't escape, and was backing up through the system, finding any exit it could, including the living space it was supposed to heat. He cleared the obstruction in minutes, used a stick to push the debris free, watched smoke begin flowing properly upward and outward. Below in the cabin, the haze cleared as draw restored smoke, finding its intended path. Sarah stood in the doorway, still, arms crossed. She didn't say anything, didn't need to. The message was clear enough. One small bird's nest had nearly caused catastrophic failure. What else might go wrong that Caleb hadn't anticipated, hadn't planned for, hadn't learned from running elk, because the old man's experience hadn't included every possible contingency? But by evening, the cabin was warm. Not blazing hot, like a room with a roaring stove, but evenly, gently warm. The walls radiating heat that had been captured from smoke, now safely venting into the autumn air. The thermometer Caleb had hung by the door read 54 degrees when outside temperature had dropped to 38. Sarah entered cautiously, as though testing ice thickness before trusting weight. She walked the perimeter, touched walls at intervals, felt the consistent warmth emanating from clay pipes embedded within. She stood in the center of the room, closed her eyes, turned slowly. "It works." 2 words barely whispered. Caleb waited for more, for acknowledgement or apology, or anything that might indicate she shared the relief flooding through him. Instead, she opened her eyes, met his gaze with an expression he couldn't parse. "It works for now. October is not January." That night, after Sarah had gone to sleep in the completed cabin, Caleb sat outside and watched smoke rise from the vent pipe into stars that seemed close enough to touch in the thin mountain air. He thought about his father burning to death while trying to stay warm, about his daughter dying from cold, a conventional stove couldn't overcome, about running elk, teaching a grief-destroyed white boy that survival required learning from people who'd already solved problems you didn't know you had. The system worked. Physics and materials and knowledge, refined over generations, were delivering heat exactly as running elk had promised. But Sarah was right about one thing. October wasn't January. The real test would come when cold descended with the weight and permanence of glacial ice, when temperatures dropped to numbers that defied human survival, when every flaw in design or execution would be magnified until failure or success became the only binary that mattered. 2 months. He had 2 months to refine the system, to test variations in fire management, to understand how the cabin performed across a range of conditions. And he had 2 months for Sarah to decide whether trust in Running Elk's wisdom outweighed fear born from burying their first child in frozen ground. Testing began with methodical precision, Caleb treating the cabin like Running Elk had taught him to treat any survival tool, probing for weaknesses before dependence became necessity. Each morning he recorded temperatures inside and out, noted wind direction, and speed-tracked how long walls retained heat after fires died to coals. The journal filled with columns of numbers that told stories about thermal mass and insulation values, about how Montana's particular brand of cold behaved when confronted with principles refined in Crow winter camps. The first genuine test came October 27th, when temperatures dropped to 25 degrees overnight. Caleb burned the fire pit for 3 hours in late afternoon, fed it pine that had been split and dried all summer, wood that burned clean and hot without the creosote buildup that plagued green timber. By the time he banked the coals at 8 in the evening, the interior walls radiated warmth. His hand could feel from inches away. He woke at 2 in the morning, habit from years of tending conventional stoves that required constant feeding. The thermometer read 58 degrees. Outside, frost had turned the world into something sculpted from glass. He touched the wall beside the bed, felt heat still present, still being released from clay that had absorbed it hours earlier and was giving it back with the patience of stone. Sarah woke beside him, noticed him checking the temperature. It's warm. Not a question, not quite acknowledgement of being wrong. Just observation delivered in the neutral tone she'd adopted whenever discussing the heating system. She rose, crossed to the far wall, the one that should have been coldest because it faced north and caught the worst of winter winds. Her palm pressed against plaster that should have been cold, as the outside air separated from interior space by nothing but logs and chinking. This wall, too. They're all warm. Caleb joined her, placed his hand beside hers on clay that had been white man's technology for making pottery and bricks, but was Indian wisdom for turning smoke into stored summer. The wall wasn't hot, wouldn't burn skin, or even feel uncomfortable against bare flesh. It simply maintained temperature 15 to 20 degrees above ambient, created an envelope of warmth that didn't blast or overwhelm, but persisted with the steadiness of deep earth that never fully freezes. The Crow call it stone memory. Clay remembers the heat, gives it back slowly when the fire sleeps. Sarah was quiet for a long time, her hands still against the wall, feeling principles that contradicted everything her Boston upbringing had taught about proper homes and civilized living. How long will it hold? All night. Maybe longer if the day doesn't warm up much. I'll need to burn again tomorrow afternoon, but not constantly, not every few hours like feeding a stove. She returned to bed without comment, pulled quilts close despite air that didn't require heavy covering. Caleb watched her curl on her side, one hand resting on the swell of her belly, where their second child grew, and wondered if warmth alone would be enough to overcome the deeper cold of being married to a man half her community considered a traitor to his race. November brought tests that exposed limits and required adjustments. A windstorm on the 5th drove sustained gusts past 40 miles per hour, and Caleb discovered that the exit vent created a whistling sound when air moved across its opening at certain velocities. The noise wasn't loud enough to prevent sleep, but was present enough to be irritating, a reminder that the system remained imperfect despite its successes. He modified the vent cap, added baffles that disrupted the airflow, causing the whistle solve the problem through trial and error, because Running Elk's camps had been situated in terrain that naturally broke wind before it reached structures. Montana's open valleys offered no such protection, demanded adaptation of core principles to local conditions. The modification worked but introduced a new variable. The baffles' reduced draw slightly meant smoke traveled through the pipe network fractionally slower, which translated to marginally more heat transfer, but also increased the risk of soot accumulation. Caleb would need to clean the pipes more frequently than once yearly, perhaps every 6 months, to prevent gradual constriction that might eventually choke airflow. He documented everything in the journal, wrote notes that read like engineering reports, even though he'd never attended a day of formal schooling, past age 12. Running Elk would have approved, Caleb thought. The old man had taught that knowledge unrecorded was knowledge vulnerable to dying with its holder, that wisdom preserved could be refined by future generations. Jacob Wright appeared on November 15th with his foreman and two miners, all of them carrying notebooks and measuring tools. Engineers come to study a system that was beginning to convince the mining operations manager that his skepticism might have been premature. We'd like to take measurements if you're amenable. Internal temperatures at various locations, wall thickness, confirmation, pipe routing, documentation. I'm planning the first bunkhouse construction for spring. Want to have detailed specifications before ground thaws. Caleb spent the afternoon guiding them through the cabin, explaining decisions he'd made and problems he'd solved, answering questions that demonstrated Jacob's group had moved past, wondering if the system worked to understanding how it worked and whether it could be replicated. They measured everything, sketched layouts, discussed modifications that might be necessary for larger structures, housing 20 men instead of a family of 3. The foreman, a Welshman named Davies, who'd worked coal mines in Pennsylvania before heading west, was particularly interested in the fire pit design. We lose men every winter to bunkhouse fires. Stoves get overloaded, sparks catch bedding, whole structure goes up in minutes. This way, fires outside the building entirely. Even if the pit itself caught surrounding grass or timber, the living space stays separate. That was my father's death. Stove malfunction, cabin fire, no time to escape. Davies nodded slowly, understanding, passing between men who'd both watched fire consume what should have been safe spaces. My brother in Wales, same thing. Thought a bigger fire meant more warmth, pushed the stove too hard, chimney ignited. He made it out, his wife and infant son didn't. They stood together in silence that acknowledged shared loss, the kind of grief that bonded strangers through recognition that certain pains were universal. Then Davies went back to measuring pipe diameters and calculating heat transfer rates, channeling sorrow into the practical work of ensuring fewer families would join the ranks of those who understood exactly what fire could take. Sarah's resistance crumbled gradually, then all at once. Through October and early November, she'd maintained careful neutrality, acknowledging the system's performance, without conceding that Caleb had been right, that Running Elk's knowledge deserved the trust she'd been unwilling to extend. But on November 20th, when morning temperatures dropped to 18 degrees and the cabin remained comfortable enough that she walked barefoot on floors that should have been painfully cold, something shifted. She was kneading bread dough when Caleb returned from feeding the fire pit its afternoon load of fuel. Flour dusted her hands and forearms, and the slight swell of pregnancy was becoming pronounced enough that she'd let out the waist on her dresses. She looked up as he entered, really looked at him for the first time in weeks, and her eyes were wet. "I'm sorry." 2 words that carried weight beyond their simple construction. Caleb set down the wood he'd brought inside for the small cooking brazier they used for preparing meals, crossed to where she stood at the table. For what? For not trusting you. For not trusting Running Elk. For letting fear of what neighbors think matter more than believing you'd protect our family. The bread dough compressed under her hands, squeezed between fingers that were working out tension through the rhythm of kneading. Caleb covered her flour-dusted hands with his own, stilled the anxious motion. "You buried our first daughter after she died in a cold cabin heated the white man's way. You're carrying our second child and had every reason to fear I was gambling her life on methods you'd never seen work. That's not distrust, that's trauma making you careful. But I bought a stove, hid it in the barn, was planning to install it the moment November 1st arrived if you couldn't prove this worked." He'd known, had found the crate weeks earlier, while repairing the barn door latch, had said nothing because Sarah's need for insurance seemed reasonable given what she'd survived. The stove sat still in its original packing, untouched insurance policy Sarah no longer needed, but hadn't yet acknowledged as unnecessary. "I know. Found it in October. Didn't say anything because you needed to know there was a backup plan if I failed. You're not angry. Anger would mean I thought your caution was unreasonable. It wasn't. You were protecting our child the only way you knew how." She leaned into him, then forehead against his shoulder, bread dough forgotten on the table behind her. Her shoulders shook with crying. That was relief and shame and gratitude, mixed together, the complex emotional weather of someone discovering they'd misjudged both a situation and the person they doubted. "What do we do with the stove? Return it if the seller will take it back. Otherwise, save it for someone who needs it more than we do. Carl Brennan's chimney has been smoking badly. Heard his wife mention it at the general store." They could use a backup if theirs fails. You'd give away something that cost most of our savings to help people who call you Crow Caleb behind your back. They call me that because they're scared of what it means that Indian methods work better than their own. Fear makes people cruel, but it doesn't mean they deserve to freeze. That night, Sarah retrieved the letter she'd written asking for help purchasing the stove, the pleas to her sister, and inquiries to Chicago suppliers. She fed them one by one to the small cooking brazier, watched paper curl and blacken, and become ash insurance rendered unnecessary by warmth that flowed steady from walls that proved Running Elk's people had understood thermodynamics before white civilization gave the principles names. December tested the system's limits without breaking them. A storm on the 8th dropped 2 feet of snow in 18 hours, buried the fire pit under drifts that required shoveling before Caleb could access the iron cover. He'd anticipated the problem, had built a wooden shelter over the pit that kept most snow clear while allowing smoke to vent freely, but the accumulation still required management. The real challenge came from sustained cold that followed the storm temperatures that dropped below zero and stayed there for 5 days straight. Caleb burned larger fires for longer periods, went through wood faster than the sustainable rate he'd calculated based on autumn conditions. The cabin stayed warm, but the experience taught him that extreme cold required adjustments to fuel consumption patterns, that Running Elk's methods needed modification when applied to Montana valleys that sometimes achieve cold the Crow camps further east never experienced. He documented the increased fuel use, calculated that even at peak demand, he was burning 40 to 50 pounds daily compared to the 100-plus pounds neighboring cabins consumed. The efficiency advantage persisted even under stress conditions, proof that the core principles remained sound despite requiring tactical adaptations. On December 15th, while Caleb was splitting wood behind the cabin, Sarah's water broke 6 weeks earlier than expected. She called for him through the window, voice tight with pain and fear, and he dropped the axe mid-swing and was inside in seconds. The baby's coming. It's too early, Caleb. It's too early. Panic wanted to swallow him. Whole memories of their first daughter arriving premature and dying despite everything they tried. He forced the fear down, made his voice steady, even though his hands shook. I'll ride for Margaret Wright. She's nursed dozens of births. She'll know what to do. There's no time. The contractions are close. This baby's not waiting for help. Then we deliver here. You've read books. You know what to expect. Reading and doing are different things. The argument could have spiraled into fear-feeding fear, but Sarah's next contraction cut off discussion, doubled her over with intensity that announced this birth would happen on its own schedule regardless of human readiness. Caleb helped her to the bed, gathered clean cloths and water heated on the small brazier, tried to remember everything he'd heard about childbirth from conversations he had mostly ignored because they seemed like women's knowledge not meant for him. The labor lasted 4 hours, which Margaret Wright would later say was mercifully quick for a second birth, but felt like geological time to Caleb and Sarah alone in the cabin with only each other and fear for company. The baby emerged small and blue, not breathing initially, and Caleb's heart stopped until Sarah cleared the infant's mouth and nose with practiced desperation and tiny lungs inflated with a cry that was more gasp than sound, but was the most beautiful noise Caleb had ever heard. A boy. They had a son. Sarah wrapped him in blankets, warmed by hanging near the wall that carried the hottest pipe runs, held the tiny body against her chest, where her heartbeat and warmth could transfer to a child who'd arrived too early and too small but was breathing, was fighting, was here. The cabin's temperature was 48 degrees, the fire pit having burned down to coals hours earlier, while Caleb focused entirely on Sarah and the birth. 48 degrees was cold for a newborn, would have been potentially fatal in a conventional cabin where that temperature represented the maximum achievable warmth and would only decline through the night. But the walls still radiated stored heat, still maintained the envelope of warmth that made 48 degrees a temporary low rather than a dangerous ceiling. I need to build up the fire, get the walls warmer before he loses too much heat. Caleb was moving toward the door when hooves sounded outside, rapid approach of a horse ridden hard. He opened to find Jacob Wright dismounting, Margaret sliding down behind him, the mining engineer's wife, already pulling medical supplies from saddlebags. Sarah's sister sent word from town, said she'd seen you running for wood in a panic. I guessed what was happening. The baby came. Too early, but he's breathing. Margaret swept past him, went straight to Sarah, and the infant began an examination that was professional assessment overlaying personal concern. She checked the baby's color, breathing rate, muscle tone, then turned attention to Sarah, ensuring the afterbirth had delivered completely and bleeding remained normal. He's small but vigorous. Born in any other cabin in this valley right now, and I'd be deeply worried about him maintaining temperature. But this room is warmer than my house with 2 stoves burning. The observation was clinical fact, not praise, but Caleb heard what lay beneath. Margaret Wright, Boston-educated wife of a mining engineer, trained in the medical knowledge her gender was permitted to acquire, was acknowledging that Indian methods had created conditions superior to white civilization's best efforts. Jacob had followed his wife inside, stood now with his back to the wall, palm pressed against plaster, in the unconscious gesture Caleb had seen repeated by everyone who spent time in the cabin. The mining engineer's expression cycled through surprise to calculation to something that might have been the beginning of belief. It's warm, genuinely noticeably warm without any fire burning inside. I've been skeptical, Winters. Believed the principle was sound, but doubted the execution would survive Montana conditions. I was wrong. Caleb moved to build up the fire pit while Margaret tended to Sarah and the baby, piling wood with practiced efficiency, coaxing flame from coals that had been waiting patiently for fuel. Smoke began its journey through pipes that would absorb heat and transfer it to walls that would store and release it through the night, the cycle that had proven itself over weeks of testing, now critical for keeping a premature infant alive. When he returned inside, Margaret had the baby nursing Sarah, exhausted but alert, color returning to her face. The thermometer read 51 degrees and climbing heat from the fresh fire already beginning to register as smoke passed through the network of pipes embedded in walls that had become their own kind of stove, diffuse and gentle rather than fierce and localized. Jacob was taking measurements again, couldn't help himself, the engineer in him needing to quantify what his eyes reported. He recorded temperatures at floor level, chest height, ceiling, documented the remarkable uniformity that came from radiant heat rather than convective warming from a point source. Outside temperature is -8 degrees. Inside is 51 and rising. Your walls are doing what a cast iron stove burning full blast would struggle to achieve, and they're doing it with residual heat from a fire that died hours ago. The Crow have known this for generations. I just applied their knowledge to materials available here. Margaret looked up from checking the infant's breathing, met Caleb's eyes with an expression that carried both respect and something like apology. My husband told me you were building some kind of Indian heating system. I'll confess I shared the general skepticism, but this child would be in serious danger in a conventional cabin. The air in here is clean, the temperature stable, there's no smoke or flame risk. You've created the safest environment for a premature birth I've encountered in Montana. Sarah spoke from the bed, voice tired but carrying conviction. Running Elk's knowledge saved our son. I spent months doubting, fearing, trying to find ways around trusting what Caleb had learned. I was wrong to let prejudice outweigh wisdom. Margaret began packing her supplies, preparing to leave now that mother and child were stable. I'll check back tomorrow, make sure the baby's feeding well and gaining weight. But honestly, you're better equipped here than most homes I visit. Keep him warm, keep him fed, and he'll thrive. Jacob lingered after his wife mounted, seemed to be working through something in his mind that required careful articulation. Finally, he turned to Caleb with the expression of a man making a decision that would cost pride but gain practical advantage. I'd like to hire you. Spring construction on the first bunkhouse begins in April. I'll pay engineering rates for you to oversee the heating system installation, train my men in the techniques, ensure we replicate what you've achieved here. I'm not an engineer, have no formal training, no credentials your investors would recognize. You understand thermodynamics at a practical level that exceeds most university graduates I've worked with. You've solved a problem that's killed dozens of my miners over the years. Credentials matter less than results, and your results speak clearly. The offer represented validation. Caleb hadn't realized he needed acknowledgement from the white world that Indian wisdom applied through careful observation could equal or exceed European engineering backed by institutional authority. He should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt tired, aware that one man's respect wouldn't shift the larger attitudes that made Sarah fear their child would grow up marked by his father's choices. I'll help, but not for engineering rates. Pay me in materials enough to build systems for families who can't afford to purchase supplies themselves. The Widow Crane's cabin is barely livable. The Morrison family's chimney is failing. They need this more than I need money. Jacob's expression suggested he'd expected the response, had perhaps counted on it. Materials it is, and I'll spread word that you're available to consult on other builds, people who want to transition away from conventional stoves. Word spread faster than smoke through dry grass. By Christmas, 3 families had approached Caleb about building or retrofitting their homes, including Carl Brennan, whose chimney had finally cracked beyond repair during a cold snap that made using it actively dangerous. Caleb agreed to help all of them, stipulated only that each family commit to teaching at least 2 others once their systems prove functional. Wisdom shared multiplies through communities. Wisdom hoarded dies with the person who kept it secret. The phrase Caleb's imperfect translation of Running Elk's teaching became repeated by families who'd experienced the difference between burning wood to fight cold and capturing heat to store against the night. The sentiment carried truth that transcended language, spoke to something fundamental about survival requiring cooperation rather than competition. January arrived with a violence that old-timers struggled to recall precedent for. The Arctic front descended from Canada on the 14th, drove temperatures from a relatively mild 20 degrees to -8 by midnight. Caleb woke at dawn on the 15th, checked the thermometer outside, saw -31, and understood that everything the system had proven so far was about to be tested against conditions that killed the unprepared with casual brutality. He built the fire pit up to levels he'd never attempted, packed it with wood until flames roared loud enough to hear from inside the cabin, fed it continuously for 6 hours until the clay pipes embedded in the walls grew hot enough that he worried briefly about whether the lime mortar in the joints would hold under thermal stress it was never designed to encounter. The pipes held. The system held. By evening of the 15th, with outside temperatures still hovering at -30, the cabin maintained 54 degrees of stable warmth, heat radiating from every surface, the wool insulation preventing any of the captured energy from bleeding outward into cold that was literally lethal. Sarah bundled their son in blankets despite the comfortable, maternal instinct, unable to trust thermometer readings that seemed impossible, given the conditions beyond the walls. The baby nursed and slept and grew oblivious to the fact that he was surviving weather that would have killed him in any conventional structure in the valley. On the 16th, the temperature dropped to -40 numbers that stopped being measurements and became abstractions. Cold so profound it existed outside normal human experience. Wind drove the effective temperature lower, still created conditions where exposed skin froze in under a minute, where breath crystallized instantly, where cattle that couldn't reach shelter died standing in fields. Caleb burned through his carefully accumulated wood stores at rates he'd never planned for, venturing out every 3 hours to load the fire pit, despite conditions that made each trip a calculated risk. The 100 feet from cabin to fire pit and back became an expedition requiring layers of clothing that left him barely able to move, that turned his breath to ice in his beard, that made his fingers clumsy and dangerous around the tools needed to manage the flames. But the cabin stayed warm, impossibly defiantly warm, the walls continuing to do what Running Elk had promised they would do, capturing heat and holding it against Montana's worst fury. 51 degrees on the morning of the 16th, when outside thermometers had stopped being able to measure cold that exceeded their design limits. Across the valley, the desperate struggle for survival played out in variations on a theme. Jacob Wright's ranch burned wood at catastrophic rates, the bunkhouse stove glowing red with overfeeding miners taking shifts through the night to maintain flames that kept interior temperature barely above freezing. Men slept in their coats, woke every 90 minutes to add fuel, stumbled through frozen darknesses in rotation that left everyone exhausted and no one properly warm. Carl Brennan's family huddled in a single room after his cracked chimney finally failed completely, smoke pouring into the cabin until he'd been forced to let the fire die and depend on body heat and blankets, his 4-year-old daughter developing a cough that worried his wife sick with memories of children who died from pneumonia following exposure. Peter Sullivan, bachelor homesteader 3 miles north, ran out of fuel on the 17th. He burned his furniture, then started on floorboards, then made the decision to try reaching Jacob Wright's ranch on foot because staying meant freezing, and maybe walking would buy a chance. They found him the next morning, frozen solid 200 yards from his own door, unable to see the cabin through whiteout conditions, dying within sight of the structure he tried to escape. Caleb stood over Sullivan's body after the storm cleared, felt guilt like a physical weight. He'd known the bachelor was struggling, had heard rumors the man was low on wood, had meant to ride over with supplies, but had been consumed with managing his own system and his newborn son and the constant demands of keeping fires burning through cold that felt personal in its malevolence. If I'd shared this knowledge sooner, if I'd taught everyone back in September instead of keeping it to myself because I was tired of defending Indian methods to people who thought they knew better. Jacob Wright, standing beside him, shook his head slowly. Sullivan wouldn't have built a new heating system in the middle of winter with a baby on the way and no money for materials. This death isn't on you, Winters. It's on circumstances and bad luck and the fact that Montana doesn't care about good intentions. But the mining engineer's words did nothing to reduce the certainty that knowledge hoarded was knowledge that could have saved lives, that Running Elk's wisdom had been meant for sharing, not for protecting from judgment. The refugees began arriving on the 18th after the worst of the cold moderated to merely dangerous levels. First came Carl Brennan with his wife and 3 children, his daughter's cough. Worse, the family having spent 2 nights huddled under every blanket they owned in a cabin, too cold for safe habitation. Heard your place stayed warm. Thought maybe you could spare a corner until my chimney gets repaired. Caleb welcomed them without hesitation, gave up the main room to the Brennan family, moved his own small family to the back area that was technically storage, but was warm and dry and safe. The Brennan girl, 4 years old with fever-bright eyes, improved within hours of breathing air that wasn't mixed with smoke, of being wrapped in warmth that came from walls, rather than having to huddle near a dangerous flame. More families followed. The widow Crane, whose cabin had never been adequately warm. The Morrison family, whose stove had cracked and couldn't be safely used. A German couple Caleb barely knew, who'd heard through the network of gossip that spreads faster than news that Crow Caleb's place was the warmest in the valley, and he wasn't turning anyone away. By the 20th 11, families had crowded into the cabin designed for 3 people sleeping in shifts, sharing meals cooked on the outdoor fire pit when weather permitted, and the small brazier when it didn't. The space was cramped and privacy non-existent, but everyone was warm, everyone was breathing clean air, everyone was surviving conditions that had killed Peter Sullivan and threatened dozens of others. Jacob came on the 21st with notebooks and measuring instruments and questions that demonstrated he'd moved from believing the system worked to needing to understand exactly how it worked so thoroughly he could replicate it. He spent the day taking measurements, interviewing Caleb about every aspect of construction and operation, documenting everything with the precision of someone who understood that details mattered when lives depended on execution. You're giving this away. Knowledge that could make you wealthy if you charge consulting fees, training costs, licensing rights. You're just handing it to anyone who asks. Running Elk gave it to me when I needed it most. I honor his gift by passing it forward. The Crow teacher. I'd like to meet him. He winters east of here along the Yellowstone with his people. But if you're serious about learning, I can arrange an introduction come spring. He'd approve of this, of white men finally being humble enough to learn from Indian wisdom. Jacob made notes, calculations visible in the margins about construction costs and material sourcing and how many bunkhouses he could retrofit before next winter arrived. His questions grew more specific, more technical, the engaged curiosity of an engineer who'd found a problem worth solving and a method that actually worked. The timeline worried him most. Spring construction would need to begin by April to complete enough units before autumn. That meant finalizing designs, ordering materials, training crews, all within a compressed schedule that left no room for error or delay. I'll commit to 20 units initially. If those prove successful through next winter, I'll expand to cover all my operations. But I'll need you on site through the construction phase winters. My men are competent builders, but this requires precision they're not accustomed to. I'll be there. But I'm also teaching anyone else who wants to learn. This can't be something only your miners benefit from. Wouldn't dream of restricting it. Every family that transitions away from conventional stoves is one less potential tragedy like Sullivan. They shook on an agreement between men who'd started from opposite positions and found their way to mutual respect through the simple expedient of caring more about results than about whose knowledge system deserved credit for achieving them. The Brennan girl, whose name was Emma, recovered fully by the 23rd. Her cough faded, her fever broke her color, returned from the pale gray of sickness to the pink of health. Her mother, holding the child on her lap while others prepared the evening meal, looked across the crowded cabin at Caleb with tears tracking down her cheeks. "You saved her." Doctor said if the cough turned to pneumonia in that cold cabin, she wouldn't make it. This warmth, this clean air, it saved her life. Running elk saved her. I just remembered what he taught. Then I owe a debt to a man I've never met whose people most of Montana wants to pretend don't exist. How do I repay that? Learn to build this system yourself. Teach your neighbors. Make sure next winter, when cold comes again, more families survive than didn't. By the end of January, the cabin had hosted a rotation of families that totaled more than 40 people, all of them experiencing firsthand the difference between fighting cold with brute force and capturing heat with systematic intelligence. They asked questions, took notes, measured dimensions, absorbed knowledge that Caleb shared without restriction or expectation of compensation. The word spread through church gatherings and general store conversations, through the informal networks that connected isolated homesteads across valleys, where neighbors might be miles apart, but information traveled faster than horses could carry it. Crow Caleb's cabin had stayed warm through the worst cold in memory. Indian methods had proven superior to European engineering. Knowledge white settlers had dismissed as primitive had saved lives, while conventional wisdom had failed catastrophically. The shift wasn't universal or immediate. Plenty of people still maintained that Caleb was an outlier, that his success didn't validate broader conclusions about Indian intelligence or wisdom. But the doubters were quieter now, less certain, aware that their prejudices were being contradicted by thermometers that couldn't be argued with, and families who'd survived because they'd been willing to learn from sources they'd previously dismissed. Jacob returned in early February with formal partnership papers, legal documents that would make Caleb chief heating consultant for the mining operation, that stipulated payment in materials and building supplies rather than cash, that included provisions for Caleb to work with other clients, provided it didn't interfere with completing Right Mining's projects. "You're trusting me with significant responsibility. I have no formal credentials, no engineering degree, nothing your investors would recognize as qualification. You've kept 40 people alive through cold that killed a man in sight of his own door. You've solved a problem that's plagued frontier settlement since white people started moving west. Credentials are pieces of paper. Results are families who don't freeze." The contract included one provision Caleb insisted on despite Jacob's initial resistance. Any family unable to afford materials would receive them at cost from Right Mining suppliers, with Caleb's labor provided free of charge. The mining operation would subsidize systems for the poor, treating it as community investment rather than charity. "You're leaving money on the table. I'm ensuring knowledge reaches people who need it most. The wealthy can afford conventional stoves and the wood to feed them. Poor families are the ones who freeze because they can't keep up with fuel demands." Jacob signed without further argument, understanding perhaps that some principles mattered more than profit margins, that Caleb's terms weren't negotiable because they stemmed from values that predated the contract by generations. The teaching began in earnest in February, 3 days weekly in the Bozeman Town Hall, with anyone welcome who wanted to learn. Caleb taught clay mixing ratios, pipe formation techniques, network design principles, the mathematics of calculating heat transfer, and optimal pipe lengths based on cabin dimensions. He demonstrated with samples, created mock-ups, that attendees could examine answered questions that ranged from basic to sophisticated. 23 people attended the first session. By the fourth week, attendance had grown to 47, including the town priest who'd previously called the project paganism, but now wanted to understand the principles for heating the church efficiently. Friedrich Baumann, the German dairy farmer, attended every session, took meticulous notes in handwriting that mixed English and German script. He approached Caleb after the third week with questions about adapting the system for his barn, about whether maintaining temperature for cattle would require different strategies. "Cows generate heat themselves. You'll need less from the heating system, but more air circulation to prevent humidity buildup. I can help you design something specific to your needs." They spent an afternoon at Bowman's farm, walking the barn, discussing modifications that would keep animals comfortable without overheating, that would prevent the respiratory issues cattle developed when housed in poorly ventilated warm spaces. Caleb sketched designs that borrowed from Crow knowledge, but adapted it to problems. Running Elk had never needed to solve the creative application of core principles to novel challenges. The barn system completed by March improved milk production by 40% compared to the previous winter. Bowman's cows stayed healthier, calved more successfully, produced milk that didn't freeze during collection, and maintained quality that commanded premium prices. Other farmers noticed, began inquiring about similar installations, created demand that exceeded Caleb's ability to personally oversee every project. So he trained trainers, identified the most competent builders who'd attended his sessions, and taught them to teach others. Created a cascade of knowledge transfer that meant the wisdom Running Elk had shared was multiplying through the valley faster than Caleb could have achieved alone. By late March, 14 separate projects were underway, families and businesses transitioning away from conventional heating towards systems based on principles refined over centuries by people white settlers were still actively pushing onto reservations. The irony wasn't lost on Caleb that Montana was simultaneously trying to erase Indian populations while adopting their superior survival technologies. Sarah recovered from childbirth and managing their infant son, who'd thrived despite his premature arrival, watched the transformation with something between pride and bewilderment. A year ago, you were Crow Caleb, the man who'd gone native and couldn't quite come back. Now you're the heating expert. Everyone wants to consult a teacher with waiting lists for sessions. How does it feel? Exhausting, gratifying, strange to be respected for the same knowledge that used to make people dismiss me. You gave them proof they couldn't ignore. A warm cabin in negative 40-degree cold that is more persuasive than any argument about Indian wisdom. Running Elk used to say wisdom proves itself in survival. The people who live through winter are the ones doing something right, regardless of whose methods they're using. The April thaw brought Jacob right east to meet Running Elk, Caleb serving as guide and translator for a journey that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. The old Crow teacher welcomed them to his winter camp with courtesy that bordered on amusement, clearly entertained by the spectacle of a white mining engineer traveling 200 miles to learn from someone his civilization considered irrelevant. They spent 3 days together, Jacob asking questions through Caleb's translation, Running Elk demonstrating techniques and explaining principles that had been passed down through generations, the meeting of two knowledge systems that had more in common than their practitioners initially recognized. On the final evening, sitting around a fire outside Running Elk's Earth Lodge, the old man spoke words that Caleb translated carefully, ensuring Jacob understood their weight. Your people think our ways are dying because you force us onto smaller lands, because you make our children attend your schools to forget our language. But knowledge that helps people survive doesn't die. It waits for the moment when pride gives way to need, when being warm matters more than being right. You came here humble, willing to learn. That humility will save more lives than your engineering ever has. Jacob sat silent for a long time, firelight playing across features weathered by decades in Montana before responding. Tell him I spent my career believing European training was superior to indigenous knowledge. Tell him I was wrong, and I'm grateful he's patient enough to teach fools who arrive late to wisdom. Running Elk laughed when Caleb translated a sound like wind through cottonwoods, then spoke again. Every teacher was once a fool who learned from someone wiser. You'll teach others who currently think themselves too smart to listen. That's how knowledge survives, one humble student at a time. Spring construction commenced the third week of April when snowmelt had turned the valley into a quagmire, but the ground had thawed enough to dig foundations. Jacob Wright's first bunkhouse rose on the mining company's eastern property, 20 beds planned for workers who'd spent the previous winter rotating through frozen shifts, feeding a stove that delivered misery in exchange for constant labor. Caleb supervised with the authority of someone who'd proven competence through survival, rather than credentials, directing crews in the precise work of laying underground channels and forming clay pipes that would determine whether 20 men lived comfortably or suffered through another Montana winter. The miners watched him with curiosity mixed with residual skepticism, white men taking instruction from someone they'd previously dismissed as Indian-touched and therefore unreliable. Davies, the Welsh foreman who'd lost his brother to a cabin fire, became Caleb's closest ally among the crew. The man understood that fire inside living spaces was catastrophe, waiting for opportunity, had visceral motivation to ensure the external pit system succeeded. He learned fast, asked intelligent questions, corrected other workers when they attempted shortcuts that would compromise the network's integrity. The clay arrived in barrels from the Yellowstone River, deposits 2 tons of bentonite-rich mud that would become the pipes carrying smoke through walls designed to capture rather than vent heat. Caleb inspected every batch, personally tested samples by forming small tiles and drying them under controlled conditions, rejected shipments that showed wrong proportions of clay to silt or contained organic matter that would burn out during use and leave voids, weakening the structure. This seems excessive. It's just mud. The observation came from a carpenter named Henderson, who'd worked conventional construction for 15 years and couldn't quite accept that material quality mattered more than speed or economy. Caleb picked up a sample from the rejected batch, crumbled it between his fingers. This clay has too much sand, will crack when temperatures cycle through day and night heating. The pipes will fail within 2 seasons, leak smoke into living spaces, maybe kill someone breathing fumes while they sleep. So no, it's not just mud. It's the difference between a system that works and one that murders. Henderson didn't argue further, began inspecting materials himself with care that hadn't been present before the convert's zeal of someone who'd understood suddenly that details carried consequences beyond the merely economic. The pipe forming consumed May and most of June, 40 men rotating through the careful work of rolling clay around dowels, creating sections that would nest together into networks exceeding 300 feet per bunkhouse. Caleb taught techniques. Running Elk had shown him the rhythm of applying even pressure, the importance of consistent wall thickness, the art of flaring ends so joints would seal without creating turbulence that might affect draw. Some workers excelled immediately, hands finding the feel of clay that wanted to cooperate when treated with understanding. Others struggled, produced pipes with thick spots that would crack and thin areas that would fail under thermal stress. Caleb rejected flawed work without apology, sent men back to remake sections until quality matched specification, earned reputation as demanding but fair, someone who cared more about protecting future occupants than about maintaining construction schedules. Jacob watched from a distance most days, arriving to check progress and staying to observe teaching methods that transformed miners into craftsmen. The engineer made notes, constantly documenting not just technical details, but pedagogical approaches, recognizing that Caleb possessed talent for instruction that couldn't be taught, that came from genuine care, whether students succeeded. You're wasting your skills on single projects. Montana Agricultural Extension has been asking about you, wants to know if you'd speak at their summer conference. Reach 300 farmers and ranchers in one session instead of 20 workers at a time. Caleb paused mid-demonstration of proper joint sealing technique, met Jacob's eyes with expression suggesting the mining engineer was missing something fundamental. These 20 men matter as much as 300. Teaching them thoroughly means they'll teach others correctly. Rush through to reach bigger audiences, and knowledge degrades through imperfect transmission until it fails and kills someone. But you could accelerate adoption across the entire territory if you worked at scale instead of one crew at a time. Scale matters less than precision. Running Elk taught me for 10 years because some knowledge can't be abbreviated without losing what makes it work. I'm honoring his method by refusing shortcuts. Jacob resumed note-taking, the scratch of pencil on paper, recording not just Caleb's words, but the philosophy underlying them. The understanding that wisdom transmitted carelessly became dangerous rather than helpful. The first bunkhouse testing occurred in late July during a cold snap, unusual for summer temperatures dropping into the 30s overnight, enough to make unheated spaces uncomfortable and provide preliminary validation that the system functioned as designed. Caleb lit the fire pit for the initial burn, supervised as smoke entered the underground channel and began its journey through pipes, snaking through walls 3 feet thick, packed with wool insulation that would prevent captured heat from bleeding outward. The miners gathered to watch, thermometers skeptical, despite months of construction labor, still half convinced that Indian methods couldn't possibly outperform cast iron stoves that represented European industrial achievement. But numbers didn't lie, couldn't be dismissed as subjective opinion or cultural bias. Interior temperature climbed from 48 degrees at sundown to 62 by midnight, maintained by radiant warmth from walls that had absorbed heat during the burn and were releasing it with the steady patience of thermal mass doing what physics demanded. The stove that had previously occupied the space, now removed and stored for potential emergency use, would have required feeding every 3 hours to maintain equivalent comfort, would have consumed 5 times the wood while delivering inferior results. Davies walked the perimeter, touching walls at intervals, feeling consistent warmth that came from all directions rather than radiating from a single fierce source. His expression suggested he was processing something that contradicted decades of assumption about proper building methods. My brother died believing fire belonged inside homes. Died wrong, it turns out. These walls are delivering more usable heat than any stove I've fed, and there's not a single spark or flame where we sleep. The vindication should have felt triumphant to Caleb, should have registered as validation worth savoring. Instead, he felt tired, aware that Davy's brother and others had died unnecessarily, victims of prideful certainty that European methods were inherently superior to indigenous knowledge, regardless of comparative results. Your brother trusted what he'd been taught by people who thought they understood heat. He wasn't wrong to trust his teachers. They were wrong to ignore wisdom that came from sources they decided didn't matter. But they should have known better, should have been humble enough to learn from anyone who'd survived longer in harsher conditions. Should have, yes. But knowing what ought to be true doesn't change what is true, doesn't bring back the dead, or make the past different. All we can do is honor them by refusing to repeat their mistakes. Construction on the second and third bunkhouses proceeded through August, with efficiency born from experienced crews having learned through initial mistakes and now working with confidence that came from understanding why specific techniques mattered. Caleb stepped back from daily supervision, trusting Davies and the best students to maintain quality standards while he focused on other projects demanding attention. Carl Brennan's cabin retrofit began in September, the family having saved enough to purchase the materials after Caleb agreed to donate labor in exchange for Brennan committing to teach two other families the following spring. The work was more complex than new construction, requiring integration of pipe networks into existing walls without compromising structural integrity or creating cold spots where old and new systems interfaced imperfectly. Caleb spent 3 weeks essentially rebuilding the cabin around the Brennan family, who continued living in the space while construction preceded a case of displaced furniture and temporary cooking arrangements, and children underfoot asking endless questions about why pipes needed to run in specific patterns and whether smoke was hot or cold or something in between. Emma Brennan, the 4-year-old who'd stayed with Caleb's family during the January crisis, followed him constantly, assigned herself as unofficial assistant, handed him tools with serious concentration that suggested she understood the work's importance, even if mechanics remained mysterious. Her mother apologized repeatedly for the child's persistence. She's fine. Curiosity is how knowledge gets transmitted to the next generation. If Emma grows up understanding these principles, she'll build better than I have, because she'll start from what I've figured out instead of having to rediscover it from basics. The Brennan system, completed in early October, tested during the first frost, and proven functional, joining the growing network of retrofitted and newly constructed buildings that were transforming how Montana Territory approached the fundamental challenge of winter survival. Word spread through agricultural communities faster than Caleb could track letters arriving from Wyoming and Idaho and the Dakotas, requests for consultation and instruction from people who'd heard through informal channels that someone in Montana had solved heating problems plaguing frontier settlement. He answered every letter personally, provided detailed instructions free of charge, included diagrams and material specifications and warnings about common failure modes. Sarah helped draft responses in English more grammatically correct than Caleb's self-taught literacy transformed his technical knowledge into clear prose accessible to readers with varying education levels. You're creating a manual without meaning to. These letters could be compiled into a guide published, distributed to everyone attempting homesteading in cold climates. Running Elk would say knowledge that helps people survive should flow freely, like water, not be hoarded or sold. Publishing seems too formal, too much like claiming ownership of wisdom that was given to me. You could credit the Crow people as the source. Make sure everyone knows this isn't your invention, but your faithful transmission of indigenous methods. The idea troubled Caleb in ways he couldn't immediately articulate, the sense that publishing would commodify knowledge that existed in a different category than things meant for buying and selling. But letters kept arriving, and the consistency of requests suggested genuine need that his individual responses couldn't adequately address at scale. The Montana Agricultural Extension's invitation came in November, formal letterhead, requesting Caleb present at their annual winter conferences scheduled for January in Helena. 300 anticipated attendees, farmers and ranchers, and agricultural professionals from across the territory gathered to share innovations and learn techniques that might improve yields or reduce losses or simply make survival through another season more likely. The speaker fee offered was substantial enough to support Caleb's family for 6 months. He declined payment, accepted the invitation on condition that attendance would be free and anyone interested could participate regardless of ability to compensate the extension for materials or instruction. Jacob delivered the extension's response personally, riding to Caleb's cabin on a November afternoon when early snow was already accumulating in patterns that promised a hard winter ahead. They agreed to your terms. Free admission open to everyone, materials provided at cost with extension, subsidizing anyone who can't afford standard rates. You're costing them money, winners, but they recognize the value exceeds the expense. I don't want credit for running Elk's knowledge. Just want it reaching people who need it before more die, like Sullivan did Frozen, because they didn't know there was a better method available. The conference wants you to bring him. Running Elk. Have him present alongside you, demonstrate techniques, and answer questions directly, rather than filtered through your translation. Caleb considered the proposal. Imagine running Elk in a Helena conference hall surrounded by white farmers who'd spent decades certain that Indian knowledge was primitive superstition. The old man would find it amusing, would enjoy the irony of teaching people who were only recently willing to admit they had something to learn. But winter made travel dangerous, and running Elk was approaching 70, no longer capable of journeys that would have been routine 20 years earlier. I'll ask. He'll decide based on whether he thinks it serves the knowledge or just serves white people's curiosity about Indians performing for their entertainment. Fair distinction. Offer stands either way. December brought the kind of cold that made the previous year's -40 seem like reasonable winter weather, sustained temperatures below zero that persisted for 3 weeks without moderation. The bunkhouses performed flawlessly, 20 miners per building, living comfortably in spaces that required a fraction of the wood consumption that had characterized previous winters. Davies reported that productivity had increased because workers were actually sleeping. Instead of rotating through fire-feeding shifts, were arriving at the mines rested rather than exhausted from nocturnal battles against cold that never relented. The Brennan cabin maintained internal temperatures in the mid-50s, despite external readings that dropped to -25. The retrofit, proving that existing structures could be successfully modified without requiring complete reconstruction. Carl Brennan appeared at Caleb's door on Christmas Eve with a smoked ham payment in kind for labor that had transformed his family's survival prospects. My daughter sleeps without coughing now, breathes clean air instead of smoke from a stove we had to keep feeding or freeze. That's worth more than any wage you could have charged. Teach the Morrison family next spring like you promised. That's the only payment. I want knowledge moving forward instead of stopping with your household. Already talked to Morrison. We're planning construction to start in April soon, as ground thaws enough to dig the fire pit. The network was replicating itself. Caleb recognized spreading through the organic connections of neighbors, helping neighbors, creating resilience that didn't depend on his personal involvement in every project. Running Elk would approve, would see it as evidence that wisdom planted in fertile ground would grow beyond the original teacher's direct reach. Sarah went into labor with their second daughter on New Year's Eve, the timing suggesting some cosmic sense of humor about marking transitions between years with arrivals and departures that redefine family structure. The birth was easier than their son's premature emergency proceeded, according to the rhythms Margaret Wright had explained during her visits to check on Sarah's pregnancy progress. The baby arrived healthy at full-term lungs, strong color good, every indication suggesting she'd thrive in the warm cabin that had proven itself through the harshest tests Montana could devise. Caleb held his daughter while Sarah rested, felt the tiny weight of a life that existed, because Running Elk had been generous enough to teach a grief-shattered white boy that alternative knowledge systems might contain wisdom worth preserving. They named her Ruth, Sarah's choice from the biblical story of a woman who crossed cultural boundaries to find belonging in a community not originally her own. The resonance with their family situation wasn't subtle, but Sarah had never been someone who hid meaning in obscurity when direct statement served better. She's warm. Born into warmth that would have been impossible last year. That's only possible because you trusted Running Elk when everyone else said Indian methods were worthless. Running Elk trusted me enough to teach. I'm just the transmission mechanism, not the source of the wisdom. You're more than that. You're the bridge between knowledge systems that should never have been separated by prejudice. Ruth will grow up in a world where that bridge exists because you built it. The Helena Conference in January drew 370 attendees, exceeding the extension's capacity planning and requiring last-minute arrangements for overflow seating. Caleb arrived 2 days early to prepare, brought samples of clay pipes and wool insulation, and diagrams showing routing patterns materials that would transform abstract explanation into tangible demonstration. Running Elk had declined the invitation, gracefully citing age and weather and a disinclination to serve as exhibit for white curiosity. But he'd sent a message through Caleb, words in Crow, that translated imperfectly but carried clear intent about teaching and responsibility and the importance of ensuring knowledge survived its original holders. Tell them I'm old and winter travel is for younger men. Tell them the wisdom they want to learn has been tried to kill along with my people. Tell them if they're finally humble enough to learn, they honor not just me, but all the teachers who've preserved this knowledge through generations when white civilization was calling us savages who had nothing worth knowing. Caleb delivered the message verbatim during his opening remarks, watched 300 faces process the accusation wrapped in offering, the indictment of past attitudes packaged with present opportunity for redemption through learning. The silence that followed was profound, uncomfortable. The collective recognition that Running Elk was correct about both the historical contempt and the current desperation that had finally created willingness to learn. The presentation lasted 4 hours, interrupted frequently by questions that demonstrated the audience was genuinely trying to understand, rather than simply collecting superficial facts. Caleb explained heat principles in terms Running Elk had used, drew diagrams showing flow through clay and insulation, calculated fuel consumption reductions that would result from transitioning away from conventional stoves. He showed photographs Jacob had taken of the bunkhouses under construction, the completed cabins, maintaining warmth during temperature extremes, comparative data documenting wood savings that translated directly to reduced labor and increased safety. Numbers convinced skeptics more effectively than appeals to morality or cultural humility, the practical benefits overwhelming enough that resistance based on whose knowledge deserved credit became obviously foolish. A rancher from Butte asked about scaling the system for larger structures, whether a barn housing 50 head of cattle could be adapted to the principles Caleb had described. Friedrich Bowman stood from the audience, described his dairy barn modification and the improvements in animal health and milk production that had resulted. I was skeptical initially. German by birth, trained to believe European methods were superior in all applications. But my cows don't care about engineering pedigree. They care about comfortable temperatures and clean air, which this system delivers more effectively than conventional heating. The testimony from someone European by origin and agricultural by profession carried weight that Caleb's advocacy alone couldn't have achieved the peer validation that overcame in-group bias more successfully than out-group argument, regardless of evidence quality. By conference CN, 47 attendees had committed to implementing the system before the following winter. Another 100 plus had requested detailed written instructions for future consideration. The extension compiled Caleb's notes and diagrams into a manual that they printed at cost and distributed freely, ensuring knowledge would reach beyond the conference hall into remote homesteads where isolation made access to direct instruction impossible. The transformation accelerated through 1893 and into 1894, the spread of thermal mass heating becoming Montana's quiet revolution in survival technology. Agricultural journals published articles describing the Crow method as adapted by Caleb Winters, included construction specifications and testimonials from families whose fuel consumption had dropped by 70 to 80%, while comfort levels increased dramatically. Letters arrived from beyond Montana, inquiries from Wyoming and Idaho, and the Dakotas from Minnesota and Wisconsin, where cold challenged survival with equal brutality. Caleb responded to all of them, noticed that his role was shifting from direct builder to teacher of teachers, that the knowledge was replicating through networks he no longer personally controlled or even tracked. Jacob Wright's mining operations completed retrofitting all bunkhouses. By spring of 1894, 46 buildings converted to external fire pit systems that collectively saved enough wood to replicate a small forest annually. The miners showed improved health metrics, fewer respiratory infections from smoke inhalation, better sleep quality, leading to reduced accidents and increased productivity. The company's investors, initially skeptical about diverting resources toward unproven heating technology, received reports documenting return on investment that exceeded projections by comfortable margins. They authorized expansion to right mining operations in 3 other territories, designated Caleb as chief consultant for all heating system installations, compensated him not in cash he didn't want, but in materials he distributed to families lacking resources for independent construction. You're making me wealthy in ways that don't involve money. Every family that benefits from materials I provide to them feels like partial repayment to Running Elk for what he gave me. Jacob, reviewing quarterly reports that showed sustained improvements across multiple metrics, smiled with the satisfaction of an engineer who'd recognized good ideas early and backed them despite institutional resistance. You should visit the Crow Reservation show Running Elk, what his teaching has achieved. The extension has photographs documenting dozens of installations, data proving his methods are saving lives across multiple territories. He knows. I write him regularly, send updates through the Indian agent who's literate enough to translate my English into language Running Elk can process. He's proud, I think, though he'd never say so directly. Pride in watching wisdom survive is different from pride in personal achievement. Tell him Montana owes him debt we can never adequately repay. The invitation to present at the Smithsonian arrived in February 1897, formal letterhead from Washington requesting Caleb demonstrate radiant heating principles for an exhibition on frontier survival technologies. The letter explained that the institution was documenting innovations that had enabled Western settlement, wanted to preserve knowledge that might otherwise be lost as territories transitioned toward statehood, and modernization eliminated techniques that had characterized earlier periods. Caleb's initial response was refusal discomfort with the idea of performing for Eastern audiences who'd view indigenous heating methods as curiosity rather than as superior engineering that had solved problems white civilization still struggled with. But Sarah convinced him that documentation served Running Elk's purpose of ensuring knowledge survived, that Smithsonian preservation meant future generations would have access even if the original teacher lines failed. He traveled to Washington in April, brought diagrams and clay pipe samples and wool insulation, created a small-scale demonstration showing how smoke traveled through channels and transferred heat to thermal mass that stored and released it gradually. The exhibition drew crowds that exceeded the Smithsonian's expectations, visitors fascinated by the elegant simplicity of a system that achieved better results than industrial stove technology, using materials available to anyone with access to clay and sand and wool. The attention felt wrong to Caleb, the focus remaining too much on him as innovator rather than on Running Elk and Crow knowledge systems as the actual source of wisdom he was transmitting. He corrected every interviewer and reporter who attempted to credit him with invention, insisted repeatedly that he was simply a student faithful to teaching. He'd received that the real story was about indigenous knowledge proving its worth when white civilization finally stopped being too arrogant to learn. Most publications ignored his corrections, printed stories anyway about Montana homesteader who'd revolutionized frontier heating, relegated Running Elk to footnote status if they mentioned him at all. The distortion infuriated Caleb, the way his world insisted on centering white achievement, even when the achievements in question belonged entirely to indigenous people whose knowledge was being appropriated through the simple mechanism of selective attention and narrative framing. Running Elk, when informed through letters what the Eastern newspapers were printing, responded with amusement rather than anger. White people have always needed to believe they invented everything worth knowing. Let them think what they need to think. The families staying warm through winter because of Crow wisdom know the truth, and that's what matters for survival. The practical impact mattered more than the credit attribution Caleb recognized, though the distortion still rankled as manifestation of the broader injustice that had pushed Running Elk's people onto reservations while simultaneously mining their knowledge for techniques white settlement required. The Montana State Agricultural Extension invited Caleb to join their staff in 1898, offered a formal position as heating systems specialist with salary in office, and budget for traveling to remote homesteads providing consultation. He declined the employment, but accepted appointment as volunteer advisor, willing to offer expertise without binding himself to institutional structures that would constrain the freedom to help whoever needed assistance, regardless of ability to compensate for services. The role allowed him to spend 6 months annually traveling Montana and neighboring territories, visiting farms and ranches, and mining camps, teaching construction techniques and troubleshooting systems that had been built according to his written instructions but were underperforming due to subtle execution errors. He took his son on some trips, the boy now 6 years old, and curious about everything, asking questions that demonstrated he was absorbing principles through observation, even when formal instruction wasn't occurring. Ruth stayed home with Sarah, too young, yet for extended travel, but listened attentively when Caleb returned and described what he'd seen, what problems he'd solved, what variations on core principles different builders had attempted with varying degrees of success. She would ask about running elk, wanted stories about the crow teacher who'd made warmth possible, created mythology around a man she'd never met, but whose impact on her life was as fundamental as anything her parents had directly provided. By 1900, Caleb estimated that somewhere between 400 and 600 installations existed across Montana. In adjacent territories, the number uncertain, because knowledge had spread through informal channels he couldn't track completely. The number represented thousands of people living more comfortably and safely than they would have otherwise. Coal and wood savings that accumulated into forests that didn't need to be cut. Children who weren't dying from smoke, inhalation or hypothermia, or the respiratory infections that claimed so many frontier families. The priest who'd initially condemned the project as paganism now presided over a church heated by the same principles, preached sermons about how God's wisdom could come through unexpected sources if humans were humble enough to recognize truth regardless of its origin. The transformation from dismissal to advocacy had taken 7 years and mountains of evidence, but represented the kind of shift that suggested larger cultural changes might be possible given sufficient time and proof. Jacob Wright turned 65 in 1902, began the gradual process of stepping back from daily mining operations, management training, his sons to take over responsibilities he'd shouldered for 4 decades. He remained involved with heating system development, continued funding material subsidies for poor families, treated the project as legacy that mattered more than mineral extraction profits that would be forgotten within a generation. You've changed Montana territory more than any mine I've operated. Wealth in the ground is finite, gets exhausted, and leaves scars. Knowledge that keeps people alive multiplies through time, gets stronger with each transmission. The credit belongs to running elk. I'm just the mechanism through which his teaching reached audiences he couldn't access directly. You're the bridge. That's not diminishment, that's recognition of necessary function. Knowledge means nothing if it can't cross from where it exists to where it's needed. The Montana statehood celebration in November 1889 had preceded Caleb's heating system development, but the 10th anniversary in 1899 featured exhibitions showcasing innovations that had characterized the transition from territory to state. The heating system received prominent placement diagrams and testimonials and data documenting its impact on settlement success and family survival. Governor Toole, speaking at the anniversary event, credited indigenous knowledge systems with contributions to Montana development that had been undervalued historically, but deserved recognition as essential to the state's viability. We built Montana on land taken from people we called primitive. Turns out they understood things we didn't about surviving here, about working with this climate instead of fighting it with brute force methods that failed catastrophically. We owe debts we can never fully repay, but we can start by acknowledging truth and ensuring credit flows to actual sources rather than to the white translators who had the privilege of access to wider audiences. The speech represented progress. Caleb hadn't anticipated political acknowledgement of injustices and appropriations that usually remain politely unspoken. Running Elk died the following spring at age 73, passing in his sleep in the Earth Lodge, where he'd spent 70 winters surrounded by family who'd learned his knowledge and were already teaching it to the next generation. The news reached Caleb through the Indian agent, a brief letter noting the death without ceremony or detail. Caleb stood in his cabin reading words that felt inadequate to describe the magnitude of loss awareness that the man who'd saved him twice, first from grief and then from ignorance, was gone, and that debt could never be repaid through any action or acknowledgement. Sarah found him standing motionless, letter in hand, and understood without explanation what had happened. He gave you everything, taught you survival and knowledge and the understanding that wisdom has no color or culture, just effectiveness and truth. I never thanked him adequately, never found words sufficient to express what his teaching meant. He knew. Teachers always know when students honor their instruction through faithful transmission. You've spent 15 years ensuring his knowledge reaches everyone who needs it, refusing credit, insisting accuracy about origins. That's the highest thanks any teacher receives. Caleb traveled east to the Crow Reservation for Running Elk's funeral, stood with the old man's family during ceremonies that blended traditional practices with Christian elements, the syncretism that characterized indigenous survival through cultural assault. He spoke briefly, words translated by younger Crow, who'd learned English in boarding schools designed to erase their language and identity. Running Elk taught that wisdom shared lives forever in the people it helps. His heating knowledge has saved hundreds of lives, kept thousands warm through winters that would have killed them otherwise. Every family that survives Montana cold using his methods is a living monument that will outlast any stone marker. The eldest of Running Elk's grandsons approached afterward a man in his 30s who'd attended one of Caleb's teaching sessions in Bozeman and had built systems for 3 families on the reservation. My grandfather talked about you often, called you the white student who understood that learning required humility, that knowing you were ignorant was the beginning of wisdom. He was proud that you refused to claim his knowledge as your own invention. I could never claim something that was given to me freely with the understanding I'd pass it forward the same way. That would dishonor both the gift and the teacher. You honored him by teaching correctly. Many white people learn from Indians and then present the knowledge as their own discovery, erase the source to make themselves seem brilliant. You always insisted on accuracy about origins. That's rare enough to deserve recognition. The conversation stayed with Caleb through the journey home, the recognition that maintaining intellectual honesty about knowledge sources was apparently unusual enough to warrant comment that the default pattern was appropriation rather than attribution. The understanding made him angry and sad, in equal measure awareness that Running Elk's generosity was exceptional, not just in content, but in the fact that most indigenous knowledge was being extracted without credit or compensation, while the people who developed it were being systematically erased. The 1905 speaking invitation from the Montana State Agricultural Extension marked Caleb's final major public presentation, a decision made consciously to step back from centralized teaching and focus on individual consultations and direct assistance to families struggling with construction challenges. The conference drew 500 attendees' testimony to how thoroughly the heating system had penetrated regional consciousness as viable alternative to conventional stoves. Caleb's presentation focused less on technical specifications, which were by then well documented and widely available, and more on the philosophical principles that had enabled the knowledge's spread. He talked about Running Elk's teaching that wisdom proves itself through survival, that the people still alive when winter ends are the ones doing something right regardless of whose methods they're using. Capturing heat rather than letting it escape isn't just smarter engineering. It's understanding that resources are precious, that waste is a luxury survival can't afford. Running Elk knew this without physics textbooks because his people's existence depended on efficiency, on making scarce fuel last through 7-month winters, on refusing to send warmth-up chimneys to heat the sky. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes, 500 people acknowledging not just practical benefits they derived from implementing the system, but also the deeper truth that knowledge came from sources their culture had taught them to dismiss, that survival in Montana required learning from the people who'd been there longest and understood the land most thoroughly. Afterward, dozens of people approached with stories about how the heating system had transformed their winters, had saved their children from pneumonia, had eliminated the chronic fear that a house fire might consume family and home while everyone slept. Caleb listened to each testimony, felt the weight of Running Elk's legacy multiplying through generations who would never know the old teacher's name but would live more safely because of wisdom he'd preserved and transmitted. The Montana governor's office offered Caleb a formal position in 1907, state heating systems advisor, with significant salary and authority to mandate construction standards for new buildings. He declined immediately, unwilling to transform knowledge that should flow freely into regulations that might restrict access or create barriers for families lacking resources to meet official specifications. Running Elk gave me this knowledge freely, with the understanding I'd share it the same way. Taking government salary to regulate what people must do feels like betraying that gift's nature. But standards could save lives, prevent poorly built systems from failing and killing people through smoke inhalation or fire. Then publish recommended guidelines that people can follow voluntarily. Offer training that helps builders understand why quality matters. But don't mandate compliance or tie it to permits that cost money poor families don't have. The compromise resulted in detailed construction guidelines that the state published and distributed free of charge recommendations without force of law that nonetheless became reference standard for anyone building or retrofitting heating systems. Caleb contributed to the manual's development, ensured technical accuracy and clarity, insisted on crediting Crow knowledge explicitly rather than allowing the document to imply state government had invented the methods it was merely codifying. The aging process caught up with Caleb through the 1920s, the accumulated wear of decades spent in physical labor, in Montana weather that punished joints and made movements that had once been effortless require conscious effort and occasional pain management. He cut back on travel, focused consultations on problems within a day's ride from home, began training younger practitioners who could carry the work forward when he no longer possessed strength or stamina to continue. His son, now 28, had become master builder in his own right, supervised construction of systems across 3 territories, taught with the same patient precision Caleb had learned from running elk. Ruth, 25, had married a rancher who'd built his home using her father's specifications, was raising her own children in warmth that running elk had made possible generations earlier. Sarah, graying and slowed by rheumatism that made winters difficult, despite the cabin's reliable warmth, watched their family expand with satisfaction that came from knowing they'd contributed something valuable that would persist beyond their individual lives. We built a good life on running elk's foundation. Our children and grandchildren will never know the cold that killed your father that took our first daughter. That's legacy worth more than any wealth. The legacy is running elks. We're just the transmission mechanism. You're the bridge he needed. Knowledge trapped in one community helps no one beyond that community. You made it accessible to thousands who would never have learned it otherwise. The argument was old familiar, the kind of loving disagreement that characterized marriages, where both parties held firm convictions about credit distribution and neither would fully concede the other's position. They'd been having variations of this conversation for 30 years, would probably continue until death separated them, the affectionate stubbornness of people who agreed on fundamentals but enjoyed the friction of perspective differences. Caleb's final major project commenced in 1925, a school building in Bozeman designed to house 200 students in warmth that would promote learning and health rather than the chronic cold that had characterized most educational facilities. The construction took 8 months, required innovations in pipe routing for a structure significantly larger than residential applications, challenged Caleb to adapt running elk's principles to scales the old teacher had never anticipated. The opening ceremony in September drew crowds that exceeded the building's capacity. Parents and educators and civic leaders gathered to celebrate a facility that represented both practical achievement and symbolic acknowledgement that indigenous knowledge deserved honored place in Montana's educational infrastructure. The school's dedication plaque credited the Crow people, explicitly noted running elk by name as the knowledge source, thanked Caleb for faithful transmission rather than appropriation. He stood before the plaque, read, running elk's name cast in bronze that would outlast everyone present, felt something unknot in his chest that had been tense for decades. The recognition was imperfect, came generations after it couldn't undo centuries of appropriation and erasure. But it was something acknowledgement that mattered because it created record that future students would have to incorporate into their understanding of whose knowledge had made their warmth possible. Caleb died in January 1927 at age 74, passing in the cabin he'd built 36 years earlier, surrounded by family who'd gathered when it became clear the end was approaching. The walls still radiated warmth from fires burned the previous day, clay pipes still performing the function they'd been designed for, capturing heat and releasing it with the patience running elk had promised would characterize systems built correctly. His final words, barely whispered to his son, leaning close to hear, carried instruction to the end. Tell running elk I honored his teaching. The funeral drew 800 people from across Montana and 3 adjacent states' families who'd benefited from Caleb's consultations builders. He'd trained children who'd grown up warm because their parents had been willing to learn from sources white culture had taught them to dismiss. Jacob Wright, 90 years old and frail, delivered eulogy that focused less on Caleb's achievements and more on his integrity, his refusal to claim credit for knowledge that wasn't his, to own his insistence that truth mattered more than recognition. Caleb Winters built bridges between knowledge systems that prejudice and pride had separated. He honored his teacher by teaching others with the same generosity Running Elk had shown him. He refused wealth and position and fame because they would have distorted knowledge that was meant to flow freely to anyone who needed it. Montana is warmer because he lived here, and I mean that both literally and as assessment of his moral character. The Crow delegation that attended 6 representatives from Running Elk's family and community performed traditional blessing that acknowledged Caleb as brother regardless of birth culture, as someone who'd earned belonging through respect and humility and faithful transmission of knowledge entrusted to his care. Sarah lived 7 more years past in 1934 at age 76, spending her final winters in the cabin that had proven Running Elk's wisdom repeatedly. Her children found among her papers a letter she'd written but never sent addressed to Running Elk, though he'd been dead 3 decades. Words of gratitude and apology for her initial resistance and explanation that she'd needed time to understand that wisdom had no color. The cabin stood until 1954 when Caleb's grandson demolished it to build a modern house with electric heating that was convenient but expensive and ultimately less efficient than the thermal mass system that had preceded it. The clay pipes removed during demolition showed no cracks after 63 years of continuous use testimony to Running Elk's understanding of materials and Caleb's faithful execution of construction principles he'd been taught. The pipes were donated to the Montana Historical Society, became centerpiece of an exhibition on frontier survival technologies that traveled to museums across the western United States through the 1960s and 70s. The display credited the Crow people prominently included photographs of Running Elk and Caleb together, taken during their 1897 meeting, told the story of knowledge that had been dismissed as primitive, until desperation made white settlers humble enough to learn. The Montana Hall of Fame inducted Caleb posthumously in 1998, 70 years after his death, recognition of contributions to state development that had been undervalued during his lifetime, but were acknowledged retrospectively as transformative. The ceremony included Crow tribal representatives who spoke about Running Elk's teaching and its preservation through Caleb's faithful transmission about the importance of crediting indigenous knowledge, rather than allowing it to be erased through selective historical narrative. The thermal mass heating principles Caleb had spread through Montana evolved into the modern masonry heater industry systems, refined through engineering analysis, but based fundamentally on the Crow wisdom Running Elk had taught and Caleb had transmitted. The global industry generated billions in annual revenue, employed thousands, saved immeasurable quantities of fuel, and prevented countless deaths from house fires and smoke inhalation. Running Elk never received royalties or recognition proportional to his contribution. His people never benefited financially from knowledge they developed and preserved. But the survival rate of families using his methods exceeded alternatives by margins that translated to lives saved, warmth provided children who reached adulthood because they'd grown up breathing clean air in temperatures that supported health rather than threatening it. The museum exhibition in 2015, mounted in Helena, on the 124th anniversary of Caleb's cabin completion, featured the original clay pipes alongside modern masonry heaters, documented the direct lineage from Running Elk's teaching through Caleb's transmission to contemporary applications worldwide. The placard beside the pipes included Running Elk's words, as translated by Caleb wisdom, that had proven itself through more than a century of practical application. Knowledge that helps people survive doesn't die. It waits for the moment when pride gives way to need, when being warm matters more than being right.